Hi, David. Happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining the Red Cow podcast today. I know a lot about you, but it would be good to introduce yourself to our listeners, our viewers. So, can you please tell me a bit about yourself, what it is you do, and why you're an important guest for us today?
Yeah, thanks, Tunde. Thanks for having me. Hi, my name is David Samson. I'm fraud investigations manager, and basically what that means is I cover everything from fraud risk management to developing controls to also managing the actual process of investigating confirmed fraud cases. I work at Paystack at the moment, and I have been with Paystack for about 6.5 years now. Um, yeah, and that's basically it.
Okay, fantastic. So you're an OG in the fraud space, like that. 6.5 years, that's a while. So definitely looking forward to the conversation today. I'll take you back a bit because when you kind of introduced that, for people like me, I really got it. But like for instance, when you're speaking to them back home, like your siblings, family members, and they say, David, what do you do exactly? What is the Cliff Notes version of what that you tell the non-compliance and non-fraud people in the world?
Yeah, so I think my job definitely starts with prevention or fraud prevention to be precise, right? So which means like try to stop the fraud before it happens. And if all else fails, if fraud eventually does happen, you need to rise to the occasion and investigate, and put together learnings and find a way to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So basically, learn from past experience.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, David. So I mean, I was looking earlier. I was looking at your kind of your professional trajectory over the last few years, and I can see that you've worked across multiple, I guess, spaces. You've worked in customer success, chatbacks, and now you're working like in fraud investigations. So, kind of, how did your journey lead you into kind of what you do now, fraud risk management? Can you just talk us through that journey?
Yeah, today I think this is one of those things that I speak about quite often. Basically, I think this is one of
Okay.
those detours to destiny, right? I think I started out on a completely different path. Maybe I should go further back than customer success. I'm actually
Please.
a civil engineer by trade. Um, so yeah, I'm a civil engineer by training, and I think I just always had my eye on fintech. I'd just always been interested in tech. So my first tech role was actually as a graphic designer, and I think I also dabbled with some UI UX before it became really cool. It's over a decade ago, and yeah, so I was a civil engineer, or I studied civil engineering, but I always had my eye on tech. Um, so I think this was supposed to be a detour, right? I took an internship at Paystack. It was supposed to be a 3-month thing. Just explore a passion and see where it goes. And I think 3 months turned into 6 months, and 6 months quite literally has turned into 6 years. So it was supposed to just be a brief detour, but I think it's led me down what I like to think is a path to destiny. Sorry if that sounds very serious, but
No, no,
that's
no. I quite
basically
like
what it
that
became.
detail to destiny. I love that. Yeah, I love that
Yeah,
detail to destiny. So, I mean, uh, civil engineer to fraud. That there's a lot of stuff. I'm sure we could even do a whole episode just
I
talking
need to
about
fill in the
all
gap.
the
Yeah,
experiences that led to it. Maybe you need to even like write a book or something about that. But I mean, so yeah, I mean, so
at some point.
if you can, yeah, if you can, just kind of fill us into. So you got into Paystack. You kind of worked in UI UX like you said before it got cool. But then so what was it that then put you with that fraud space? Was it just like
Yeah.
progression within the organization, or there's a particular challenge that they were facing, and you're like, David, he's one of the smartest guys around. He can figure it out. So how did you get into that particular job function within the organization?
That's Yeah, so I think the simple answer is that there was a need, right? So as I said, I joined on an internship. At the time, the company was really trying to figure out disputes management as a whole, right? And so I joined on it. It was supposed to be a short-term basis, just see what you can do within a few months. Put some structure in place, build some processes out, and maybe move on to something else. But then it became clear that there was need for very hands-on work, right? So first it was improve the processes for dispute management, and then it turned into fraud also needs some attention, right? We're struggling with the inbounds we're getting from banks and from partners. It was like, okay, you know what, try your hands out at that as well. And then once we figured out that part, it was like, okay, how about we're a little more proactive? I know we've figured out this inbounds. How about we find a way to get ahead of the fraud and prevent it as much as possible, right? And it was like, okay, you know what, work closer with the product teams, find ways to design the controls. And it was like, okay, you know what, now let's find a way to actually assess our products before they go live, and conduct fraud risk assessments. And I think the need was what just kind of kept on will I say pushing me, right? The need presented itself, and I saw it as an opportunity, and I think I just kind of took it and rose to the occasion, if I can put it like that.
So, was there any particular case that, and from a personal perspective, was there a particular case where a moment that you thought to yourself, you know what, fraud prevention is where it's at, that's where I want to play? Was there a particular thing that was a trigger for you in your journey?
Yeah, so I think like most people who work in tech, you dabble in a few different things, right? Like I said, I started with product design. I had a brief phase where I wanted to be a product manager. I think it lasted like 2 quarters in a whole. But basically, there was a period where I became fascinated with the idea of, creating an idea in my head and putting down a product requirement documentation, working with the engineers to develop technical specifications for these products, right? So there was a period where I was very interested in creating things from scratch. And I think it was somewhere around there that I started to, play around with designing controls and designing, how do I put this now? Designing products with fraud risk in mind, right? So I think somewhere around there, when I fantasized about being a product manager, was probably where I think I got really, into this prevention step.
Thanks, fantastic. And I think you've been in the space now for a while. In your kind of experience, what makes, because everybody says, oh, fraud in Nigeria is different. It's not the same as in the US, not the same as in the UK, or even in India. It's unique. So, do you agree with this kind of assertion that fraud in Nigeria is unique? And if it is, what is the thing that makes the fraud landscape, quite that unique compared to other markets, in your opinion?
Yeah. In my personal opinion, I think there's maybe 2 or 3 things that I'd highlight. One will definitely be the cultural element. I think Nigeria is one of the few places in the world where, you are celebrated for how much money you have, regardless of how you got it, right? And I think because it's socially acceptable, or maybe not socially acceptable, but at least there isn't enough stigma assigned to people who, acquire their wealth through, illegal means, right? There isn't enough stigma around that kind of behavior, so it can be seen as socially accepting it. So I think definitely that has a major role to play in why fraud in Nigeria is different. I think maybe a second thing that I'd say, and I'm not really sure if this is a chicken and egg situation, but I think the adoption of cryptocurrencies and just how comfortable Nigerians have gotten with it. I'm not sure if it's a case where it's because of the fraud that they've gotten comfortable with it, or if I think maybe it happened the other way around, right? But I do think that has like a major role to play in just like how different the landscape is here. And I think maybe finally I would say there are just so many payment methods. I think traveling around Africa, you find that like a lot of countries have just one major way of of making payments. But in Nigeria, you have cards, and cards are really big. bank transfer is big. There's so many QR payment methods, and I think every month, every year, there's something completely new. I guess with the fintech ecosystem also just really maturing, right? So I'd say those three things: culture, the use of cryptocurrencies, and then definitely just the sheer number of payment methods, which I think is increasing our the attack surface area, if you can put it like that. So yeah.
Yeah, I like that. I like that attack surface area. You mentioned something on crypto, and I want us to kind of double click on that in a bit. But I want to focus on this attack surface area because, I mean, I've had conversations with people in the space all about financial inclusion, banking beyond bank, and a lot of fintechs have kind of come into the space specifically because there's this drive to see how they can bring more people within the financial ecosystem, within the financial umbrella. And that's why we have so many of these different payment methods. And so I guess it's one of those where it's an unintended consequences kind of thing, where there's so many different payment methods to try to reach the larger populace. Because there's so many payment methods, you have to think about this. There are so many different avenues for fraud. We call it attack surface area. So, and a lot of these are kind of new technology. Some of them are homegrown technology. So, in your experience, like, how do you think fraudsters in Nigeria have adapted to all these multiple payment technologies? Is there a preponderance of fraud around the specific channels? Maybe USSD, because I mean, from talking from my experience and what we do at Breakfast, we've seen that USSD sometimes is a very easy path when people are trying to do ATO for account takeover fraud and all of that kind of thing. So, are there particular channels that you've seen in your experience where it's kind of the fraudsters have kind of gravitated towards?
I'll start by saying that historically, fraud in Nigeria and maybe even on the continent has been considered unsophisticated. The romance scams have not really required a lot of technology in the past, right? But I think in recent times, the fraudsters have definitely been moving with the times, right? They've been adapting to the use of technology. So you mentioned USSD. There's something very simple that we've seen play out multiple times where the fraudsters are able to understand how the USSD platforms work, right? They understand that once they get a hold of your phone, they know all the codes to dial, the ones to get your BVN, the ones to check if your phone is enrolled, for USSD transactions, right? They've gotten quite knowledgeable about how the systems work, right? I mean, there's also been some chatter about how the financial institutions may also have a very significant amount of insider threats, where the people who are committing the fraud have had hands-on experience operating those products, so they are usually able to they understand it from the inside out, right? So with things like that, it's no surprise that they are able to reverse engineer things very quickly. But in terms of which channels I've seen, I think in recent times, bank transfer has been the preferred payment method of a lot of people making payments online. I think before that, it was cards, and I think cards are still big, but definitely declining because a lot of people, as I said, are now tilting more towards bank transfers. So I'd say right now, I would say cards probably still have the biggest share, but it's definitely declining year on year, and I think that's happening in favor of bank transfers because and some people tend to think that cards being pool payments, being that you are charging the card, versus a push payment, which is the bank transfer where the customer is the one pushing the funds to the recipient. People tend to think that the push payments should be safer, seeing as the customer needs to go through some form of authentication on their phone or their internet banking app or something before the payment can be initiated, right? Versus the cards where they can just once they get a hold of your details, put in your details on checkout, right? They can initialize a transaction, right? But we found that the fraudsters have adapted. They've found ways to, log into your mobile banking app as you, right? They found ways to, social engineer people to, provide all the details that they need to sign up on internet banking as you, right? In some cases, they also need some form of physical compromise, which means they may need to get a hold of your phone, even if for a short time. But the point is, they've gotten very, very comfortable with using technology, and they understand how these products work inside out. Uh, yeah.
Thank you so much, David. And I think that question, and I think the conversation is actually going into the questions that I really wanted to get answers to. Hopefully, have this discussion on. When you talk about the channels and then the way that the fraudsters have been evolving and getting more knowledgeable, and I think the issues around the insider threats and sophistication, even not just in the approach that they're taking, but also in the level of education about the processes that some of these fraudsters have. So that's actually quite interesting. This year, at 2025, I think it marks 11 years since we had BVN. I actually remember 10 years ago when the government put that hard deadline on every bank account must have a BVN, and everybody was scrambling, and we didn't know what BVN was. And I guess we know the reasons why, historically, why BVN was created. There's a number of reasons, but I'll speak specifically around how this concerns this conversation, which is around fraud. I actually went to a physical bank today. I'll not get into it because it was very frustrating, but I went to a physical branch today to try to do a transfer, and then historically they would have asked for my ID card, all of that stuff. The guy just said, "Oh, bring your fingerprint, put it there." All my details came up with my BVN and stuff. So BVN has been a good, in my opinion, has been a good multiplier within the ecosystem, financial ecosystem in Nigeria. Now, BVN and NIN, in your opinion and in your kind of experience, how has that helped with managing fraud? I think it's a double-edged sword, and maybe I can share my own personal general opinion. I think it's the double-edged sword in the sense that if you have it and it's secure and it's working well, it does the job. But when someone gets access to it, and when people get black market access to BVN and all of that stuff, it then creates a whole set of problems. So, in your opinion, talk me through what BVN and NIN has done for the fraud ecosystem in Nigeria.
Yeah, thanks, Tunde. I think you kind of took some of the answers right out of my mouth. But definitely, I think fraudsters thrive in anonymity, right? Which means that anyone who is trying to commit fraud wants to do it anonymously. They don't want you to know who they actually are. And so, enforcing that, transactions or any accounts that need to be created require some form of identity, document, or, in this case, identity number, is a good way of preventing fraud, because that way you are forcing people to identify themselves before they can access the financial ecosystem. However, as you also rightly noted, if that database or if that means of identification is compromised, then the issue of either identity theft or synthetic identities become a problem, right? Which means like people can now fabricate entire identities that don't actually tie to any one person. In some cases, they either assume the identity of someone who is deceased, or they create a completely new identity based on different fragments from different people's real identities, right? And basically what that does now is that the information that you have in the database for BVN or for NIN now becomes very unreliable and doesn't actually tie to any one person. The point is, definitely BVN and NIN has been helpful. It's good to see that Nigeria is also building that database that allows them to identify all Nigerians, and also based on that identity, they are now being granted access into the financial ecosystem. But as you also rightly noted, if that data is compromised, then we have a big problem on our hands.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I've heard so many stories, and some of the stories that when I hear them, I'm actually a bit worried. When they say, "Oh, there's people like sharing this deep BVN on the black market, tens of thousands of BVNs and NIN, people creating synthetic identities." So I mean, yeah, it's an interesting one, and one that thankfully it's people like you within the ecosystem that are fighting the good fight, and I guess some of us in the other side of the ecosystem that are supporting. So yeah, it's a fight that every needs all hands on deck. Um, I want to actually now go away from kind of the ecosystem and go back to you as a person and understand a bit more about your own personal experiences. So in every even for me, I mean, back when I was a lawyer, there's always a case that I would talk about. Oh, there was this case that it was the most interesting case. Da 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 da. So I mean, for you, are you able to share a story of a fraud case? Obviously, you can redact it, take away all the things that would identify the people involved, the companies involved. But are you able to share a story that shaped how you think about fraud prevention? That was more kind of foundational about your okay, this is how we should approach it. Oh, yeah. So, any insights, personal insights on in that regard?
All right. Yeah, I think maybe and maybe on a lighter note, the cases that have definitely pushed or driven me to fraud prevention have been cases that involve law enforcement. I think when you have your first experience with law enforcement, it kind of, you know, you when you get back to the office, you understand that you need to take prevention more seriously. So I think definitely probably my first case with law enforcement. But maybe more practically, there have been a few different cases. And as you said, I may not be able to go into detail. But I think when you see how fraud can be very easily tied to human behavior, right? Being able to track, so for example, there's the fraud triangle that explains um, the three things that need to happen or that need to be present for fraud to occur. The first being motive, which means people need to have a sense, they need to feel some pressure that pushes them to feel like they need to commit fraud. The second is opportunity, right, which means that they need to feel like there's a gap somewhere that they can exploit. When they feel like that gap exists, and you add that to the pressure, you get to the last step, which is rationalization, which means they need to tell themselves why this is okay, right? And I think in terms of prevention, some of the cases that have probably influenced me have been somewhat simple cases, right? So you find cases where a person uses one of their family members, cards or mobile account, right, to fund a gambling transaction, right? You see cases like that where someone who is so impulsively I'd say addicted, right, to gambling, right, and feels that they need to gamble, right? So I've established pressure, and then because they have access to their family members' cards, or someone's phone in the house, they have established the opportunity, right, and then finally, like, they are able to somehow rationalize to themselves that it's okay that if they take this 1,000 naira, if they take this 10,000 naira, and they hit it big, then it's fine. I can give this person their money back. I can take care of everybody. Everybody is fine. Everybody wins. This is okay, right? They rationalize to themselves. And I think when you understand that, like, at the end of the day, fraud is also about understanding, or fraud prevention is also about understanding human behavior. Like, how do people think? How do they perceive pressure, right? How do they spot opportunity? And then how do they rationalize the behavior to themselves? Like, it helps you, like, approach it, more effectively, right? Because then you can just counter them at each of those steps, counter the pressure, counter the opportunity. Rationalization may be a little more difficult to counter, but I usually say that the opportunity is the biggest place where you have room for improvement. Like, even if the pressure exists, take away the opportunity, right? If you take away the opportunity, then that chain is broken. And even if the person feels pressure, even if they rationalize the behavior, they never really have that opportunity, and so you are able to prevent fraud before it occurs.
Thanks, David, for that expose on the fraud triangle. And I think you're right. The opportunity is the area where you can get the most wins, and that's the area really that is within the control of the financial institution. You can't really control the first and the last. You can control the middle.
Yeah.
Reduce the how did you call it? The attack area.
Yeah.
You can control that field. The
Exactly.
attack area. Thanks, David. Just a couple of more questions for me. I know that you're a very busy man, so I want to let you go. And I don't want you because I don't want to put you in a difficult spot. So maybe we can put it on a higher level. So generally, because I know that the industry is a small industry, it's a growing industry, and people like you are at the forefront of not only sharing your knowledge within your organization, but I kind of diffusing it across, whether it's with regulators or with other FIs. So, in your opinion, of either your personal opinion or kind of what you can forgotten from other people, what are some of the mistakes that you see Nigerian FIs making when it comes to how they approach fraud management?
Yeah, thanks, Tunde. I think I was at the meeting that had like regulators and other financial institutions recently, and someone put it brilliantly. They said our opposition is called organized crime, right? But we are very disorganized. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that financial institutions are making in their fight against fraud is that they are attempting to do it alone. I think first thing that everyone needs to fix, you need to find your allies. You need to find the people that you're working with, right? As much as, I know everyone wants to protect, you want to protect your own space. I need you to understand, I need, people to understand that a compromise of one is very much a compromise of all. If someone is able to access one financial institution, I want you to understand and I want you to know that they are very likely to also access yours, right? So I think first things first is collaborate, right? Maybe other things that I would also, strongly recommend would just be spend some time learning from the people that you are trying to prevent or that you're trying to counteract, right? And sometimes spend a minute, if you get the opportunity, sit down with these guys and just listen, right? Listen well, because I find that there's a bit of hubris, there's a bit of arrogance with which like people approach fraud prevention. Like you think you are better than the people that are committing the fraud, right? Or you are smarter, rather. You think you are smarter, and then you realize very quickly that this person has a hand, has a leg up, right? They are one step, they're just one step ahead of you every time. Just know that the way to like find out some of these details involve working closer with law enforcement. Because the law enforcement agencies, the law enforcement officials are the ones who interface with, these, fraudsters, right? They're the ones who apprehend them. They're the ones who interrogate them, right? Sometimes spend some time just, talking to them and spend the time talking to the law enforcement officials, and you'll find that they have things to tell. They have stories to tell. They have information to share with you that you will learn from. And I think that it's honestly hubris, or it's just plain arrogance to think that you know it all, right? If you knew it all, then they wouldn't be gaming your system. Yeah, I think because there's usually financial implication involved, it may not be as straightforward um, to employ penetration testing or white hat hacking, as you refer to it. But I think that there's a variation of it that allows us to simulate you know uh, issues, or to detect a problem and then report it, right? So, for example, human intelligence is one of the major sources of how do I put this now? It's one of the major sources of intel that then results in fraud detection. A lot of times we're dependent on people telling us that somebody did something, right? And so, in a way, there is a way that you can detect without necessarily committing the crime, right? It's a lot more difficult to do white hat hacking with fraud, because I think you know because of the money movement that's usually required, and I say the money movement is required for fraud for something to be categorized, or at least a transfer of value, right? But I think that there's still a way that human intelligence can play a role in fraud prevention. I think from time to time we have people, send in tips, about something that they've observed, right? And so I still think there's a way that, human intelligence can play a role in fraud prevention.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, David. You mentioned that you were in a meeting, and I know of this meeting where you had with regulators, and then you mentioned around the biggest challenge around lack of collaboration. And I guess the question is, what is the key thing that is missing? Why do you think that we're not seeing that collaboration? You referenced the fact that everybody wants to kind of focus on their own.
Yeah, you'd be surprised how much of fraud management has something to do with human behavior and with culture. But I think there's also a very strong cultural element in why people or why institutions are not willing to collaborate. I will get to the legal and regulatory implications or the legal and regulatory constraints, but I will start with culture. I think naturally, or culturally, Nigerians are not the most collaborative people, right? People like to keep what's working to themselves, and they want to mind their business as much as possible, or at least keep their business to themselves. I think what I said earlier about how there's priority on how much money you've made versus how you made the money. People want to keep certain things secret. It's cultural, right? I think that same thing sort of carries over into the financial ecosystem. So people want to keep the secret sauce to themselves. But I guess talking about legal and regular, or back to legal and regulatory constraints, I know there's a strong data protection element. In every time I've had these conversations, one of the first points that come up is, do we have protection for companies who choose to share this, who choose to share data with other institutions, right? Without maybe like a legal covering, without a court order, right? And many times we've not been able to get very clear answers. We've not been able to get very, very clear answers on, whether there are any provisions in the law or in our data protection regulation that allow for people to share information or to share data with other other institutions in the case of fraud, or for the purpose of fraud prevention. However, there have been some very good points about how it's possible to share signals without necessarily breaching data protection laws. People talk about federated learning, where you can train a model with data without necessarily sharing personally identifiable information with the model, right? There are different kinds of advances in technology now that allow us to at least share intel between each other without necessarily sharing the raw data itself. But I think those two elements are very key. I think culturally, we're not sharers. We are not people who like to tell our secrets to each other. The legal and regulatory element is also there. People don't want to be seen to contravene the law by sharing information. And I think maybe finally, everyone is just worried about their brand and their image. They don't want to tell someone else. They don't want to have to admit to someone else that that they had a fraud incident or that something happened. So collaboration, it makes collaboration difficult if people don't want to be vulnerable, right? And I think that also is a cultural thing.
Fraud evolving in Nigeria over the next 5 years. Maybe 5 years is a bit too far out. So in the next, call it 18 to 24 months, especially with AI and then faster payments. Like, how do you see fraud evolving?
Yeah, I think one thing I'm sure of is that I'm not going to be out of a job for a very long time, because I'm certain that the issues are only going to get more. I think recently I was in a conversation where we talked about how people can use deepfakes to bypass liveness checks, and I think for a second, like my mind, I struggled to think of like how that plays out. But I mean, the point is, like, it's happening already today, right? And if we think of how quickly AI has sort of just AI and the multiple use cases for it have just skyrocketed in the past few years, I think it's right to limit our prediction to 24 months, because 5 years from now, I have no idea what will be happening. But I think what I'm definitely sure of is that we are going to see a lot more technical fraud attempts. I said earlier that fraud on the continent has historically been unsophisticated. It has gotten more sophisticated in recent years, but we're about to see it get even more sophisticated. For example, people who don't even know how to write code today will be able to understand documentation, will be able to interpret error messages, and they will be able to use more technical tools simply because they have access to AI, right? And so what that means is the common criminal, the person who is not trained in computer science, or is not good with software engineering, is now able to commit more technical, more sophisticated crimes. And so I think we can expect that this democratization of knowledge, like this ease of access, will also signal an increase in more sophisticated crimes.
Thanks, David, and thanks for your time. The final word, if you had a magic wand and you could make anything disappear in the fraud space, apart from making fraud itself disappear, what would be the thing that you would make disappear?
I mean, in Nigeria, definitely the thing I would fix is like the cultural problems, right? I would fix it instantly, right? The fact that people are so comfortable with it, right? The amount of influence that fraud has on our entertainment sector, I would just like fix it instantly. Not to go into more detail, but basically, there's theories about how fraud money is sort of funding entertainment in Nigeria, but definitely stuff like that will be fixed immediately if I had a magic wand.
Okay, thank you so much, David, and thank you so much for taking the time out to chat with us, for chatting with me. Looking forward to engaging with you again. You said you live in person, you exist in person. I'm looking forward to catching up with you in person soon, hopefully.
Anytime, and thanks for having me today.